Hey, welcome everyone to the February Great Falls Forum. My name is Marcella Paris and I'm the Lewiston Public Library Director. For those who are new to our series, the Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. This year marks the 23rd season of the Great Falls Forum. I want to thank those of you who are joining us here on Zoom and also the folks with us on Facebook Live. A recording of today's program will be available starting tomorrow on the library's YouTube page and also on Facebook, actually immediately after the program. Please visit lplonline.org for any further information on that. Please mark your calendar also for our March 18th Great Falls Forum, which will feature Rose Barboza and Jerry Edwards, who are the co-directors of Black-Owned Maine and co-owners of Black-Owned Maine Media, on the topic, A Rationale to Support Black Business in Maine. More information on that is also available at lplonline.org. A little housekeeping for today's virtual program. Those of you who are on Zoom will see a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. You'll want to use this to enter any questions that you have for our speaker today. You can do this throughout the program and she'll be taking questions at the end. For those who are joining us on Facebook Live, go ahead and type your questions in the comment box there and we'll make sure that they get to our speaker. And today I have the pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Andrea Breau. Andrea received her BA from Colby College and her PhD in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from The Ohio State University, where she taught for nearly a decade. Her work focuses on the racial, gender, sexual, and place-based identities of teenagers in Lewiston. She is especially interested in how Lewiston's young white and migrant communities interact. Andrea's deep Maine roots led her to her research in Lewiston, where she currently resides with her husband and daughter. Andrea has worked for both Lewiston Public Schools and the Lewiston Public Library, and most recently for the Diverse Bookfinder at Bates College, where she coordinated the launch of an online tool to help public libraries across the United States diversify their children's book collections. She served on the board of directors for the YWCA of Central Maine from 2014 to 2019, and in 2019 served as project scholar for the Maine Humanities Council book series commemorating the centennial of women's suffrage in the US. Andrea currently sits on the Androscoggin County Committee of the Maine Community Foundation and the Diverse Bookfinder Advisory Council. A big welcome to Lewiston's own Dr. Andrea Breau.
Thank you, Marcella. I'm very excited to be here today, and I don't know if it's a common practice to dedicate a talk, but it's my hometown, so I'm going to do it. The reality for so many women who do scholarship is that it's simply not possible without childcare, especially for those who do this work outside the borders of academia. My research in this talk today, in the midst of a pandemic that has unleveled the playing field, so to speak, for so many women, just wouldn't have been possible without the selfless labor of my mother, Nancy, and my husband, Shad, who are Lewiston kids themselves, and their unwavering care for our ED. So I dedicate this talk to all three of them. You guys are the reason I do what I do. I also want to say thank you, obviously, to the Great Falls Forum and its sponsors, the Sun Journal, Bates College, and the Chamber of Commerce, but especially the Lewiston Public Library for having me. As a Lewiston kid who found my own kind of refuge in this library, hiding out in the mouse hole, everybody remember that? With a stack of books, just waiting for whoever was going to come in with their own stack so we could eye each other. I've been alarmed by the shrinking of resources devoted to truly public spaces like these. It's here where encounters across difference are the norm rather than the exception, and where staff are charged with creating places that youth not only can but want to be. The fact that nearly all 43 of my research participants elected the library as our meeting place attests not only to their parents' view of it as safe, but I think more importantly, speaks to its accessibility and the sense of ownership and privacy youth feel they have here. Based on our conversations, these are not things teens come by easily, and so this is no small thing. I owe a big thank you to LPL, not just for making my research possible, but for its continual commitment to doing better when it comes to serving all of Lewiston's communities. So thank you. That's from my heart. I am going to share my screen because I have a presentation for you all today, some visuals. I'm hoping that this works. I'm actually just going to do that. For some reason, my talk has disappeared. Where did it go? Sorry, technical difficulties. Give me 1 second. Shoot. Try something different here. I don't know why this is giving me a hard time. So hang with me for a minute. I'm sorry. This worked when we tested it. Marcella can attest to that. Okay. So, almost there. Okay, I think we're ready. Sorry about that. Hopefully you can all see this. There we go. All right, thanks for hanging with me on that one. That was unplanned. So I'd like to start by sharing a bit about my journey to this work. All scholars, no matter the fields, are in relation to our research, to the questions we ask, why we ask them, and how we attempt to answer them. But I can still recall a member of my dissertation committee saying something along the lines of, "You're going to do research in your hometown? Are you out of your mind?" I laughed then, but I think I understand now what he meant. You may not find what you or others hope to hear. You may have to hold cherished histories, events, and objects up to scrutiny, and you may end up with insights that are uncomfortable to share. But like all the rule-breaking feminist scholars who paved the way for me, I did it anyway. I believe then, and more so now, that a critical understanding of how beloved places shape us and how we shape them brings with it a more complicated love and perhaps a deeper commitment to changing those beloved places for the better. I can't deny that in this way, it's my heart that drives my work. So thank you all for joining me today. I hope I can offer at least one insight that's new to you and maybe even uncomfortable. And if you leave with more questions than answers, the educator in me won't complain, but also put those questions in the Q&A because there will be some time at the end. Okay, so though my interviews with youth took place in 2015 and 16, my work actually starts by examining one of these earlier cherished Lewiston events, that is the Many in One rally of 2003. That January, in my last semester at Colby, I drove home to attend the standing room only 4,500 person rally held at Bates in support of Lewiston's newest residents, approximately 1,000 people who had begun relocating here from elsewhere in the US. Some of you were probably there and will remember that the rally was a counter-protest to a much smaller gathering down the road of neo-Nazis opposed to Somali settlement in Lewiston. I remember the infectious energy at the Bates rally, waving happily to my former school teachers and friendly faces in the audience, and watching local white and Somali youth speak about the importance of mixing across racial, cultural, and religious difference. I was both deeply moved by their bravery to speak to such a large and very white audience, and equally unsettled by the infectious feel-good atmosphere their voices seemed to incite in the audience, including in me. I also felt a connection between the two rallies that gave me an even deeper pause. In retrospect, this was the first time I, as a white person, was confronting the ways dominant whiteness shapes not just the contexts we're meant to reject, like the white supremacist rally across town, but even those we're meant to celebrate. In this case, what I pinpoint as the birth of Lewiston's multicultural love story and the script about youth that became so ordinary to hear from then on. We've all heard this story, maybe we've even told it ourselves, and I heard it on repeat in my conversations with youth. It sounds like this. If the older generations in Lewiston would just let the younger ones lead the way, those who are mixing across difference, our new problems would disappear. Or, as the youth put it, Eden, who was 15 years old, white identified girl, she said, here everybody's just like, it's separated. There's uptown versus downtown and classes of people, but at school it's different. A lot of people mix together. Like I'm friends with a lot of different Somali people and I just think it's hard with the parents. The parents are the problem, honestly. Parents obviously didn't grow up with a big mix of different cultures and race stuff, but we did, so it's not new to us. All of us, we've all grown up together and we just know each other. And then Milo, a 17-year-old Somali Bantu identified boy, said, Lewiston is mostly not, it's half other people and half us. And that's a good thing, because having people your own kind, speaking the same language every day and going to school with people you know, it's a good feeling. There's a lot of Muslims here. It's good to have people that's your own kind around you. Everybody is united, so many people around. It's an oasis, the city. We all get along in school and we all know each other. I like everybody in the school, like different races. I'm cool with the white girls, the white boys. This is the youth will save us all narrative. It's admittedly seductive because it offers a hopeful response to ongoing racial, ethnic, and class segregation in Lewiston, reflected time and again in my conversations with youth. Though Eden and Milo point out very real class, racial, ethnic, and cultural divisions in Lewiston, they simultaneously claim youth as those who are willing to bridge those divides. Furthermore, their words reflect that this segregation has very different effects in each of their lives. My decision to do research with teens was driven in part by my employment at the high school and the library, where I spent lots of time hanging with the first generation of white and Black immigrant youth coming of age together in Lewiston. And frankly, the stories I heard and observations I made didn't always match up with the ways well-meaning adults, youth themselves, and the media and other institutions have really leaned on local youth as symbolic of the multicultural solution to the new diversity problem in Lewiston. And so I was left with a mountain of questions about the expression and effects of this story in Lewiston, which ultimately is what brought me to this work. I wanted to talk to youth. So today, I want to tell you a little bit about how I went about talking to youth and who I talked to, and then we'll examine this narrative of youth as the multicultural solution and how it travels in Lewiston. Next, we'll look at the effects of this narrative, both current and historical, by considering some of Lewiston's cherished events and ignored histories. And finally, we'll conclude with a look at media coverage of the 2015 Soccer State Championship and youth responses to it. So really quickly, my research is based on an empirical qualitative study that examines existing social relations in Lewiston through in-depth interviews with 43 youth during a 6-month period between 2015 and 2016. The questions I asked were simple, focused on how youth get on with the business of living in Lewiston, but the answers never were. In the end, I had over 38 hours of audio recordings and hundreds of pages of transcribed text or stories, within which I was able to identify consistent and repetitive themes, patterns, and topics, and put them into a broader context. Finally, I know that there's been a lot of research in Lewiston in the past 2 decades, and the terms of such have not always been transparent. So I'm happy to share more about the details of the study approval process and participant recruitment phase, etc., during the Q&A if anyone's interested. So just pop those questions in there now. But I will share that my study was intentionally unaffiliated with any youth organization or programs, school, nonprofit, or government institution. Though there are organizations doing fantastic work with Lewiston youth, I felt it was important to offer the participants a space where they could feel mostly free from those associations that are otherwise such a central part of their lives. So let me tell you a little bit more about the research participants. They ranged in age from 14 to 21, though the majority were between 15 and 17. As far as their racial ethnic identifications, 29 identified as Black, 13 as white, and 1 as Asian. I use their own self-identifications here in all but 3 cases in order to further protect the identities of those youth. Most of the Black youth identified as African and Black and American, as distinct from older family members' continuing identification with being African in America, and as distinct from their multi-generational US-born Black American peers. Regarding distinctions between Somali and Somali Bantu, again, I followed the youth's own self-identifications here, though all of the Black youth also spoke about being lumped together or generalized as Somalis and or Muslims by the majority white population, including youth who didn't identify as either. As far as their religious identifications, 27 of the teens were Muslim, including 1 who was in the process of converting. To Islam, 3 were Christian, including 1 who had recently converted from Islam, and 13 had no affiliation. In terms of gender and sexuality, there were 27 girls, 1 of whom was trans-identified, 16 boys, 1 of whom was trans-identified, and 5 of the kids explicitly identified as LGBTQ, although of course there's always the possibility that there are kids who just didn't come out in the interviews. In terms of their generation in the US, 17 were born in the US, 7 of whom were born in Lewiston, and of the 36 not born in Lewiston, most had spent more than a decade on average in Lewiston, and the majority of their lives in the US, which is what I refer to as 1.5 generation. In terms of the languages they spoke, the majority of them were multilingual, although all interviews were in English because that was the shared language between myself and the youth. And in terms of social economic status, the majority of them were from working poor, working class, or lower middle class families, which was based on my own evaluations of their parents' professions or their housing situation in Lewiston, and or if they talked about class during our interviews. So let's return now to 2003 and the birth of this narrative of local youth as the multicultural solution to Lewiston's new diversity troubles. A couple days after the rallies, Democracy Now!, a progressive-leaning US news program that covers global issues, reported on what they called the Lewiston controversy in a segment entitled 4,500 People Rally in Support of the Somali Community of Lewiston, Maine Against Neo-Nazi Rally. The report features lengthy interviews with adult leaders of anti-hate organizations about the now infamous mayoral letter of 2002 discouraging Somali relocation to Lewiston that was the incitement for both rallies. But it opens with a recording of two Lewiston High School students, Kara and Sophia, who were asked to speak about their friendship at the Many in One rally. This is the original image displayed while the audio runs, but it's tough to hear, so I've transcribed their words here. Kara opens and says, "During the summer program, we got to know each other, and I'm so proud to say that Sophia is one of my closest friends. I've sat at her dinner table and I've gone to a Somali wedding, and what an amazing door it's opened for me. I think that if we all learn to accept one another and to become friends with our Somali brothers and sisters, that we can achieve that beauty and that peace." And Sophia followed with, "I'm really surprised to see, with so many schools around the world, that some people are still ignorant. Who are they to tell me that Kara can't be my friend because she's white and I'm black?" Though Sophia's insistence that the real problem is racist ignorance produces some uncomfortable laughter from the audience, it's Kara's emphasis on becoming friends across difference to achieve peace and beauty that gets a really enthusiastic reaction. And this is the only time we hear from youth in this piece. 13 years later, here's a CBS National Evening News clip from April 2016 entitled "After Bumpy Start, Maine Town Embraces African Immigrants." The 2.5-minute report, which most prominently features the Lewiston High School principal and his reflections on the benefit of diversity to Lewiston, begins with a boisterous, diverse crowd of LHS students and ends with another boisterous, diverse crowd cheering on their school, their community, their kids. And that's a quote. During the 2015 Boys Soccer State Championship. So I'm going to just play this clip quickly.
They fled poverty and violence in East Africa and resettled in a strange, forbidding land, Lewiston, Maine. Many in town already knew what they thought of the refugees, and then they met them. Here's Don Daler.
Lunchtime at Lewiston High School. The hallways fill with a boisterous, diverse crowd of students.
See the spindle fibers there?
What's remarkable is this school used to be almost entirely white. Now nearly 25% of the kids are East African refugees.
And how's that working out?
It's working out really good in our schools.
Principal Sean Shabbat.
You'll see kids interacting with all kinds of other kids. There isn't different groups of students. They're all one big school.
But it wasn't always so idyllic. When the refugees began arriving 15 years ago, many longtime residents were resentful. Lewiston's economy was tanking. Businesses were closing. Jobs were scarce. The newcomers were seen as welfare freeloaders.
They say, "Why you come here? Go back where you come from."
Store owner Shukri Abhishek fled Somalia in 1999. She says attitudes changed when people saw how hard the immigrants were willing to work.
When we come here, we need education and peace and work.
In fact, the city's public assistance spending has remained unchanged since 1990. But what has changed is Lewiston itself. The town of 36,000 is now home to about 6,000 refugees who've revived downtown.
I believe we're better off having a community where it's acceptance, that people trust one another.
Some people just need to be educated and ask questions.
Just get to know you.
Just to get to know us.
High school senior Abdi Sharif's family moved here when he was 9.
Number 10, Abdi Sharif has
Last year, the Lewiston High soccer team, which Sharif captained, won the state championship, the first in school history.
And how many players on the team are Somalis?
we have about 26 players on the varsity team, and I want to say roughly about 21 of them were non-Native Americans.
4,500 people turned out for the championship game to cheer on their school, their community, their kids. Don Dale, CBS News, Lewiston, Maine.
And that's the CBS Evening News for tonight. For all of us at CBS News, all around the world, they fled poverty and violence in East Africa and resettled in a strange, forbidding land, Lewiston, Maine. Many in town.
I'm going to move to the next slide so that doesn't keep playing like that. So though we hear a few words from the team's captain about the need for education and asking questions, the journalist interrupts to interpret this as the quote, need to get to know one another. And this is the only time we hear from youth. Notably, the piece fades with the image of one of the LHS athletes in the midst of happy celebration after scoring the winning goal. As tidy, mostly silent bookends to this report, youth serve as the symbol for multicultural unity in this now, quote, idyllic town. Both of these reports emphasize the support or embrace of Lewiston's Somali residents, presumably by white residents, though that's never explicitly stated, but after a few bumps, quote, right, bumps. To be clear, these bumps are, as described in the reports themselves, Lewiston's municipal government leader opposed to Somali settlement in town, two organized national neo-Nazi groups who attempted to gain local support on the heels of this formalized opposition, and a much broader white resentment of unwanted others in a context of 40 years of deep economic security. In both reports, it is youth's easy ability to unify across racial and cultural difference that serves as the symbolic, hopeful solution to what are, in fact, deeply rooted systemic issues. Is the lesson here that genuine youth friendships across difference don't matter, or that youth achievement doesn't have a real impact on the community? No, I share these only as examples of the ways Lewiston youth over the past 2 decades have truly become a symbol on local, state, and national stages of the hopeful multicultural solution to the, quote, new problem in Lewiston. The conversations I had with youth made it clear that this may be doing a further injustice to those actually experiencing the bleak landscape of American racism against which we need to imagine hopeful futures in the first place. So what does it mean to turn youth into a symbol? The use of youth voices, activities, and achievements as media or institutional props renders their much more complicated experiences of race, gender, culture, and religion in a deeply segregated Lewiston either silent or worse, illegible. In other words, impossible to speak or understand. For example, in a conversation with 18-year-old Somali-identified Duya about the colorful murals that have been cropping up on walls in schools and nonprofits that serve youth, she said, I see that everywhere. You see the picture of a Somali girl, so a Black Muslim girl wearing a hijab, and a white guy and a white girl. In the high school, you see a bunch of minorities and identities all holding hands and stuff. Everyone's all diverse. They're basically saying they love diversity and, quote, I'm not racist. It's this, let's be inclusive. We all matter now. Let's be one community. We'll be friends. Kumbaya. In other words, these murals do the work of spreading that feel-good atmosphere birthed at the Many in One rally. Duya expresses suspicion not of the art itself or of the commissioned artists, all of whom are local youth, but of what she identifies as the effects of this visual, quote, kumbaya story. It is a way to profess a love of difference and to appear as not racist without ever acknowledging racism or its consequences in Lewiston, like segregation. I would add that there is another important appeal specifically for youth in this multicultural love story, which is to be legible or seen and celebrated within its narrow terms. That is, youth have their own investments in and attachments to the promise offered by multicultural unity in Lewiston. So let me give you an example of what I mean by legible and illegible within the terms of this now commonplace story. This discussion about murals with Duya was followed by a conversation about LHS students being asked by the principal in 2014 to remove a Black Lives Matter poster. And just to be clear, it's not the same principal that we just saw in the CBS clip. Duya was frustrated with how the students responsible for the display, 4 Black girls and 1 white girl, were quickly silenced and then chastised by school administrators for hanging it, quote, without permission. The partial display on the right is the one that was removed after it was hung just down the hall from this permanent mural on the left. In the terms of this story on the left, you can be celebrated for doing the unifying that the multicultural solution calls for to the diversity problem. In this story on the right, By calling explicit attention to systemic anti-Black racism, you become the problem itself, the very threat to the unity of the multicultural community. Though the BLM display was eventually allowed, notably after the students contacted the press, it was hung on a bulletin board in a place with significantly less foot traffic and in an area then known as the Civil Rights Hall. The terms of youth legibility, to be civil, to unify, to spread the feel-good, not to divide, to call attention to, or to make explicit the actual problem that divides, were made quite clear in this move. Interestingly, since my conversation with youth ended in 2016, many more murals have arrived on the scene, and I think of Duda every time I see one. Even when these murals center youth experiences of racism and their commitments to anti-racism, such as this one, commissioned in 2017 as part of a Stand Against Racism event hosted by a local nonprofit, somehow the overarching narrative manages to recenter colorful unity and youth's symbolic position as those who both represent this diversity and bridge it, bring it together, make it one. I have a couple other examples. I'll go through them quickly, but I've purposely not included pictures of the youth artists, as my critique, again, is not of them or their art, but rather of the continued use of their voices, activities, and achievements as a symbol of Lewiston's multicultural unity. I've included the source, date, and headline that accompanied reports on the murals. Whoops. So here's one. It says "One World, One Future." The person featured is not one of the youth. And you can see the caption says, "By depicting the world as one color and omitting all national boundaries, the youth successfully depicted the world as a unified whole, in this way encompassing the diverse population of Lewiston." This is another one. The headline for this one was "Creators of Mural Hope to Send Message of, quote, togetherness." Now this one was actually a video clip on News Center Maine, and it actually featured a whole bunch of murals, but this was the, shoot, what's it called? The feature image that that News Center chose to display before you play the video. And the title was "Brushstrokes Break Down Barriers at Lewiston High School." And interestingly, the other murals actually feature historical figures with legacies of anti-racist work, but those were not featured. They weren't the feature picture for the video. So the question here is, what are the effects of this story and its feel-good consequences? So as the movement for Black lives in Lewiston this past year, led by local youth, once again made explicit and undeniable, the problem here, like elsewhere in the US, is not racial or cultural or religious difference. If it were, the celebrated willingness of youth to mix across these differences could and would solve the continuing marginalization of Black, immigrant, and Muslim youth in Maine. The data about this reality is alarming and plentiful, and it can be found in places like the 2017 Maine ACLU report on inequity in education for immigrants and students of color, and the US Department of Education Civil Rights data collection on public schools, and the ongoing reports on juvenile justice by the Justice Policy Program at the University of Southern Maine, in data on the racial disparity of COVID rates, and so on. No, the problem is not race and culture and religion, but racism, and more specifically, anti-Black racism, all tangled up with anti-Muslim sentiment. And though neither is a new problem in Lewiston, the power of this feel-good story of multicultural unity, with youth as the symbol of its hopeful but always deferred future, is that it obscures these painful current realities and historical truths. The truth is, anti-Black racism is hand in hand with white settler colonialism that forced and keeps Abenaki people off these lands, the very reason Lewiston was so white for so long. As Maine historian Candace Kane's research on a small community of freed slaves sent to work here in 1866 has illuminated, Lewiston historically lacks large and enduring Black communities or institutions, in no small part because these men and women were relegated to exploitative household and farm labor and barred from higher paying jobs in the mills. The very ones, side note, that my white ancestors came from French Canada to fill. Eventually, despite genuine attempts to make Lewiston home, to take care of each other and to grow, as this clipping about the establishment of a mutual benefit society attests, most of these residents had no choice but to leave the state for a chance to thrive in larger Black communities. And of course, there's Lewiston's economic history and its foundation in an industry that flourished thanks to cotton grown on and shipped from southern plantations, a history Bates students are just beginning to flesh out by diving into the local archives, including the ones at the library. This legacy of a town whose demographic composition and social and economic systems are rooted in anti-Black racism has remained up through the mayor's letter in 2002 and into the present as the very context for the just released set of recommendations to address systemic racism by Mayor Kayer's Ad Hoc Committee on Equity and Diversity. Anti-Black racism is not tangential, but rather central to our history, and we must continue to reckon explicitly with its impact today. But we can't do that if we're required to remain within the terms of, to use Duya's words, the Kumbaya story. Okay, but anti-Muslim sentiment, that's a new problem for Lewiston, right? And what does it mean to say it's entangled with anti-Black racism? To answer this question, I want to return to yet another cherished moment in Lewiston history. In 2015, I began my research to much local and national buzz about the documentary film Raising Ali, a Lewiston story. Premiering on the 50th anniversary of Muhammad Ali's controversial 1965 World Heavyweight title boxing match in Lewiston. In the film's narrative, Ali is the exceptional Black champion athlete who uses the space of the boxing ring to, quote, transcend race, transcend everything, unquote, in order to come out on top. The film positions Lewiston as the perhaps unlikely but nevertheless characteristically American place where this, quote, divine transcendence of difference happened and is still happening. The film holds Ali up as a mirror image of both the Franco-American struggle to transcend a blue-collar, quote, inferiority complex and the Somali refugees, quote, fight for a better life in Lewiston. The film concludes with a happy illustration of an all-American city where anyone can succeed if they, like Ali, have the tough grit that it takes to transcend, well, everything. I remember sitting in the audience that spring night warmed by the post-film glow of happy feelings that by now felt so familiar, when my pesky old friend discomfort returned. Raising Ali had managed to turn Muhammad Ali into Lewiston's hero in 2015, but only through a double erasure of Lewiston's anti-Black racism and the anti-Muslim sentiment that was deeply tied to it in 1965. In other words, the film turned Ali into the greatest disappearing Black Muslim. The match in Lewiston was in fact Muhammad Ali's first under his adopted Muslim name, which the media refused to use. In 1965, Ali was a deliberately politicized figure who used his athletic platform to profess his association with the Nation of Islam in the struggle for Black self-determination. Not only was he not the favored in a match against another vilified Black boxer, but his association with the Nation of Islam made him the bigger threat to white America that day. And he knew that. Ali was not in any way attempting to transcend, to get over or move beyond race or culture during that match, but was in fact rooting himself in his experiences of race and racism as a Black man in America and in the Nation of Islam's cultural practice of resistance to white supremacy. The full fight is accessible on YouTube, in which you can hear the crowd of over 4,000 continuously booing Ali. Though Raising Ali uses archival footage of the fight, it doesn't include any audio clips in which you can hear the crowd's displeasure, and nor do we ever hear from Ali himself. The film renders the Black Muslim, the dominant face of Islam in America at the time of the fight, invisible and silent in its particular, quote, retelling of this historic event through an emphasis instead on Ali's resilient, masculine, winning body and athletic prowess in the ring. And this was a story that was about to make a full comeback 6 months later.
Six nations, one team. Still reeling from a championship soccer game 2 weeks ago.
It was honestly, the happiest moment of our lives because the fans all went up, the stadium, everyone was yelling.
The stands tell part of the story. The highest attended soccer game in state history. The city of Lewiston on a united front. How many of you are refugees? All of you.
Yeah.
Before coming to Lewiston, they lived in refugee camps, Turkey, the Congo, Somalia, to name a few. In the States, a whole new world. But one thing translated quickly, their love for the game.
Back in our homeland, we didn't really have much, so soccer was a way to, escape from the hardships.
In a time when immigration and refugee status is constantly being debated, this team is symbolizing the power of tolerance, acceptance, and working together.
If they can do this together as a team now, it just proves to me that they can do that together after high school or in the workplace.
In fact, the team is now the topic of a documentary, the trailer quickly going viral, created by a Lewiston alum and former player.
To see a team from different cultures build up from the bottom and have one goal together as a team and accomplish that goal is just an amazing feeling.
Creator Ian Clough told me that he is in the process of getting a
Sorry, go back here.
Six Nations.
I don't know why they keep autoplaying. Sorry about that. So this was just the beginning of the local and national media storm around the Lewiston High School boys varsity soccer team after their 2015 and later 2017 and 2018 state championship. This attention lasted for 3 years and included coverage by CNN, The Huffington Post, USA Today, CBS Evening News, The Christian Science Monitor, Sports Illustrated, HBO Real Sports with Soledad O'Brien, NBC's Today with Jenna Bush, as well as a documentary film and red carpet rollout to a sold-out house at Lewiston's annual film festival, and a trade book from a major publishing house. In the overarching narrative they tell, the soccer field, rather than the boxing ring, serves as the space of happy unity, ultimately deflecting attention from the ongoing segregation in Lewiston, echoed time and again in these youth narratives. And as promised, it delivers on those infectious happy feelings, which I heard on repeat from white and black youth alike. These champion black athletes, saved by American refuge, a narrative this clip hinges on, put Lewiston on the map, redeemed its reputation as a second-class city, and gave Lewiston a good name. But the contradiction at the heart of that is that, like the boxing ring, the soccer field makes the impossible demand that the black champion athletes who occupy it, composed primarily in this case of Somali boys from immigrant and refugee families, and makes the demand that they transcend race, culture, religion, everything in order to win and to maintain their position as the iconic symbol of Lewiston's multicultural unity. While the players I interviewed saw this as promising, as a way to disprove the racist ways they were ordinarily marked in their everyday lives in Lewiston, and these are things they told me, as ungrateful refugees, welfare-dependent immigrants, as Muslim terrorists, as at-risk boys, as black thugs. I argue that the soccer field is where their marked otherness actually mattered most. The effects of this fundamental contradiction were reflected in the narratives of Somali youth who do not play soccer. For example, after they had talked to me for some time about their experiences with everyday racism in Lewiston, I asked friends Willem and Vec how they felt about the soccer championship. Willem responded, "It brought people together, but at the same time, as I see from race, it's just one of those stories where they only want to claim the Somalis or the immigrants or the minorities when it's something beneficial or when they have an incentive. It's kind of a way of also avoiding the root of the problem, like, yay, we're such a great community, but once that 90 minutes is over, it's right back to having Somalis and it's back to reality." He makes it clear that reality or racial segregation is what happens once the game is over, and that the story being told about the championship is in fact an incentive to avoid its root cause. For Willem, it's only through an evasion of this root cause that Lewiston can be perceived as such a great community, a reputation which exclusively benefits Lewiston rather than his daily experiences of racism as a Somali youth in Lewiston. His friend Vec clarifies that it's racism, not difference, that serves as the root cause of segregation in Lewiston. He says, "For a while we haven't seen Somali people be looked up to, making it up. When the soccer team won, it's like the Somali people in Lewiston have a face now, but they don't show our struggle. It brought us together, basically, so it made white people feel closer to us somewhat, but some people are still nasty." Vec embraces the visibility the championship brought to Somalis as people worthy of emulating, which in and of itself speaks to the ordinariness of racist beliefs about Somalis in Lewiston. But he's suspicious of the sudden close feelings the accompanying narrative of togetherness seems to have incited in Lewiston's white residents. The struggle he refers to as invisible is not the typical one of escape and refuge that dominates in media narratives about Somalis, as in the clips we've seen today, but rather their encounters with racism in Lewiston. His comments made it clear that this racism continues despite the circulation of the happy story about the soccer championship, and that this narrative has its own racist effects. The latter was reflected in 16-year-old Somali-identified Paco's comments about the very real effects white people's closer feelings have had on his life. So I'm going to read this quickly because we're running out of time here and I do want to get to some more. He basically just says that prior to the soccer championship, his friends, white parents wouldn't let them hang out, but when they heard his name after the soccer championship, they thought, well, maybe he's a soccer player, they can hang out, which for him testifies to the kinds of racism that circulates here. So for these youth, it's racism, not soccer, that defines what bringing closer or coming together across race, religion, and culture looks like in Lewiston. So I'm actually going to skip playing this clip. It's only a minute, but I think it's really important to include the voices of some of the players from this championship team to understand the complex ways they've negotiated a story that gave them a kind of celebrity in Lewiston, one that they acknowledged in our conversations as both pleasurable and exhausting. Though due to this celebrity, I'm especially wary of identifying the players I interviewed, and so I'll just offer a brief aggregate picture of our conversations, which were remarkably similar despite interviewing them individually. I attribute this to the fact that they had had so many media interviews by the time we met that the intensity of this public gaze resulted in practiced, self-reflexive public personas. They were performing. I share this to implicate my own study as very much a part of the scrutiny they were already under, and to illustrate that these youth were quite aware that how they chose to tell their story depended on the interview context. This was most evident in our conversations about the media's strong emphasis on them as refugees and the erasure of the Black Muslim in the championship story. When I asked them directly about this narrative of the refugees circulating in the media, this is what they had to say. Clearly, we are refugees and we are from Africa. It's not something I'm scared to tell. The difference with those news people is that the Syrian situation has nothing to do with us winning the state championship, but we can't say that. After all those interviews, we started hearing the word refugee more, but before that, we really don't mention it that much. The more years kids spend here, the more Americanized they become, the more they forget about their background, won't know what they went through when they were a refugee. So it really wouldn't make sense for them to say, oh, I'm a refugee, because they were raised here and they lived in this culture. Sometimes we just look at ourselves as American kids, an American boy. These boys, most of whom are 1.5 generation, do not identify as refugees, which explains the laughter in that clip as all of them raise their hands to the prompt, how many of you are refugees? They know they cannot reject that narrative because they will no longer be legible under the terms of the story being told. Their laughter hides their desire to exceed the ways they are marked and the pain of having to negotiate the stereotypical images of the Muslim terrorist, called up by the reference to Syria, and the figure of the refugee that ultimately prevent them from being, quote, looked at as American boys. The multicultural fantasy reproduced by the media is that soccer is the space where the refugee happily and willingly transcends their racial and cultural and religious difference, an act central to becoming American, so that those differences can be loved and these youth incorporated into the nation through a celebration of their exceptional athleticism, much like Ali. And this is an incorporation they seek, as revealed by their multiple reminders to me that they've been in Lewiston for years and they're American kids, Mainers, and US citizens. Finally, though Islam only appears in the media narrative through images of these boys fleeing terror, this is a quote from the Soledad O'Brien clip, fleeing terrorism, civil war, and murderous tribesmen in East Africa, a very different version of Islam is central to their own narratives of soccer. As one athlete shared, we all pray together sometimes, like family, you know? And in an amusing twist on this, another shared, you say you're gonna go pray, you have to pray. You can't lie about praying. But during Ramadan, when we usually go to the mosque to pray, I tell my mom I'm gonna go, but I don't. I go play street soccer until 2 a.m. Though typical expressions of the importance of religious faith were apparent in our conversations, they explained Islam as vital to living a good life and as central to an afterlife. Most importantly, their narratives made it clear that Islam is what sustains their sense of belonging to a Somali community in Lewiston. Everyday religious practice, even when they're harmlessly fibbing about their actual participation in it, is what keeps them tied to their families and Somali community. And the soccer championship has made that community proud of them, despite often being suspected of, quote, Americanization due to the larger and impossible demand that they transcend their religion and culture on the field. For these boys, soccer is more than just participation in a sport, not because it offered safe refuge in America, as the media narrative repeats ad nauseum, but because it's central to the formation and maintenance of their racial, ethnic, and religious identities as Somali and Muslim in Lewiston. So I'll finish here actually by returning to the beginning, to a fall day in 2015 when I sat down with two Somali Bantu identified sisters and the story they told me with an unexpected openness that set the tone for the next 6 months. I say unexpected because I was well aware of how the lives of Black, Muslim, and immigrant populations in the US, particularly youth, are hyper scrutinized. And here I was, a white adult and total stranger, asking these youth to share their lives with me. All 43 of the youth who sat down with me did so enthusiastically, and I owe this project entirely to them, and of course to the parents who gave them permission to meet with me, despite the precarious position they often occupy in the US. At the heart of the story these sisters told me that day were the complicated ways youth attempt to navigate belonging in a pretty ordinary context of segregation and overwhelming whiteness in Lewiston, and an equally ordinary and conflicting, as we've seen, demand to mix across difference. That is, to love one another and just get along. In their story, gender, sexuality, and religion played prominent roles not only in the ways their own racial ethnic identifications formed, but in the ways racial and ethnic segregation and dominant whiteness is maintained in Lewiston. It's no wonder then that the interview concluded with one sister offering, "It just makes you feel like, where do I belong?" And with her sister responding, "It's a lot of pressure for us to understand this stuff. Every day I have to ask, what do I need to change to make my day better?" The story these sisters told me during this very first interview outlined the ways that young people's struggles for coherence or understanding and social acceptance are practices of survival that are neither purely resistant and active nor entirely complicit and passive. That is, youth do not have some superpower that the rest of us don't to somehow step outside of the histories and social forces that structure our social relations in Lewiston. The hopeful expectation that they can and impossible demand that they do means that they often hold themselves responsible for the failures of racism and its underlying social hierarchies that Lewiston is in no way immune to. Thank you, and I will stop this sharing so we can have some question and answer.
Okay, I will go ahead and read off the questions as they come in. Just a reminder to everyone that you can continue to submit questions while Andrea answers, and we will do as many as we have time for. We're here until 1. So the first question we've got here is, how did you select your interviewees? Did you advertise in school? Did some encourage you to ask their friends, or others come forward as they heard about the project?
All of the above, except for school. Part of the process of working with human subjects is that your your study has to be approved by an institutional review board at wherever you're doing your research. So mine was Ohio State. And so they had to approve basically flyers and an email, although it was mostly through flyers. And I put them largely in public spaces with a lot of foot traffic. So they just described the study that I was, it did say that I was from Lewiston and that I was a researcher at Ohio State. And I said, and my focus with youth was really on their daily lives. So, and I also had an open access Facebook page that I could share, which had all the same information. And so, but I will say that after the first couple of youth who reached out to me, mostly it was a snowball effect, which is a legitimate sampling technique in research. It was word of mouth. The kids told their friends. A huge part of, I think, getting so many participants was that I had applied for grant funding through Ohio State that gave me money to pay them for their time, which, youth don't often get paid for their time. So I was able to offer them $15 an interview, which isn't much since the interviews were 60 to 90 minutes each. It's not even minimum wage in some cases. Well, the minimum wage we're hoping for, I'm hoping for. Anyway, so I think that was huge. I think being able to pay them was a big part of there's not teenagers, especially from some of the families, working class or working poor families just don't have a ton of expendable income. And so for them, it was nice to have some, but yeah, largely snowball effect. I did also, even though my research was independent of any organizations, excuse me, in town, I did talk with youth organizations that serve queer, migrant, homeless youth, and told them about my research and gave them flyers so that they could hand them out.
Another question here. Do you think these feel-good stories and portrayals create any positive outcome? Are they better than nothing, or do they create too much damage?
That is a good question. I mean, I think hopefully what I just talked about today shows that they clearly create, I think that let me put it this way. I think that the happiness and the pleasure that I talk about feeling in the audience of watching the film or being at the soccer game or watching, right, our boys, like Lewiston boys on CNN, or those are very real feelings. I think it's more the effects of those feelings, what we do with those feelings. I think that it absolutely causes harm if those feelings are largely allowing us to deny trenchant histories of racism or systemic racism in our communities, and instead feel like, no, we're good. Everybody feels happy, see? And so that's why I've become suspect, as I say through my interview, of those good feelings. I think we should feel them. You can't reject your feelings, right? It's a feeling. It's something we all have. I'm sure most of us listening have felt those things. You've all been part of, many of you are from Lewiston, and we're here for a lot of these events. So it's not about feeling guilty for having those feelings, but asking ourselves truly what those feelings do, what the effects of the story are. And I think when we acknowledge that the effects is to cover histories that we need to know in order to fight systemic racism and segregation in our own city, then it's causing a lot of harm. And for the kids, I think, like with the soccer team I talked about at the end, it often puts them in a position where if they speak about their daily experiences of segregation and racism, marginalized kids in particular, either they're not believed because there's this huge and powerful narrative that comes with happy feelings that makes them, that for people who aren't experiencing that racism, it's hard to believe. Like, how is this happening? I see all this really beautiful stuff. So it in that way, it causes a lot of harm. And so many of the kids talked about having to navigate that and also feeling those happy feelings themselves. So I guess the answer is that it's more complicated than does it do good or bad. I think it does both. And I think we have to ask ourselves what the effects are in our lives and what we're doing about it.
Have you shared with those you interviewed the results of your research?
Well, I don't really have anything to share until today. So my dissertation is not actually available until 2023. It is bound and in the library at Ohio State, but part of that is so that if I want to actually, work on a book project, I can do that. And I'm not in academia anymore, so that's not, that's a question I'm still working on. But a lot of them did say, when you have a book, can you share it with us? But I don't have a book. So unless, some of them are listening today, I haven't reached out. I will say, I guess the direct answer is I haven't reached out to any of them, honestly, because a 300-page dissertation is really not something anybody wants to read. Even I have a hard time going back and reading that. But hopefully after this presentation, which is recorded, I can share, which would be awesome.
In having conversations about systemic racism, I've noticed a trend in the belief that if we stop talking about racism would go away. As a Lewiston kid myself, I have heard this from usually white people who grew up in Lewiston, but the sentiment does not seem isolated to people who grew up in Lewiston or to white people, though I have heard it from Gen X and older. I saw a video of Morgan Freeman saying the same thing. Does this narrative of togetherness that you examined seem to be the manifestation of this belief in addition to the youth as saviors, or is it something else?
So let me make sure I understand that. So the question sounds like it's, is the demand to not talk about race so that racism will go away, is that a manifestation of the feel-good stories? I'm not sure.
I think it's asking if, is it a manifestation of if we stop talking about racism would go away?
Oh, is the feel-good story a manifestation of that?
Right.
I mean, I think I think there's a back and forth. I'm trying to think about, I think the question was complicated and good, so I'm trying to think of the best way to answer it. The feel-good story definitely encourages us not to talk about race, but more particularly not to talk about racism. So we can talk about race as long as we're all united, look at all these, this beautiful diversity, and look at how it serves institutions and towns and cities and schools. But very rarely are we thinking, in that story, are we thinking about how experiences of race and racism, I guess maybe what it does is doesn't allow those things to come to the fore, right? I guess it's just a different way to say what I've already said. And I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll stick with that.
We have a couple questions left. Let's see what we can get in these last couple minutes. Did the youth talk at all about their interactions with authorities, school, law enforcement, etc.?
It did. And I would say most of their descriptions of encounters, which were both, for lack of a better term, good and bad, right? They had many teachers that and community figures, nonprofit service leaders that they loved, with whom they felt they could be themselves, that they didn't have to suppress any pieces of themselves, but they also had a lot of encounters in institutions for youth, like schools, or in public spaces, of both blatant explicit racism and implicit racism. So being racially profiled while driving, being screamed at and having soda thrown at you at a McDonald's parking lot. In schools, they talked about expectations of low achievement, right, from their teachers. So if you want to know more about those experiences, I would say the youth experience of that were not unique in terms of what's in the 2017 Maine ACLU report. That one focuses specifically on schools, I believe. But that report really enumerates the kinds of things marginalized youth are facing on a daily basis in schools, at least. But yes, all of them had experiences to share about that kind of those kinds of encounters.
Are you okay answering one more question, Andrea? Yeah. Okay. So this questioner asks, first they say, thank you for making the decision to do your research here in Lewiston. Do you think the students would answer your interview questions differently today with the undeniable racial tension across the nation?
Yeah, I was thinking that when these interviews started, it was 2015, 2016. So it was the lead up to the 2016 presidential election. And the environment of suspicion, particularly of Black, immigrant, Muslim, and particularly of youth, right, was on the increase. And I would say that has only gotten worse in the last 4 years, post the interviews. And so, yeah, I think what I have noticed in the last 4 years is that partially because racism, explicit racism, has been allowed to come to the fore, at least to mainstream audiences, right? Explicit racism is always felt and heard and seen and experienced by people of color, but to white audiences, the explicitness of racism has been allowed to come back and show its face. It never disappeared, it's just coming back out of the woodwork. And I think that has sort of shocked some white folks awake in a way that being able to use the word racism, to say racial justice, to talk about, in Lewiston here, like the sort of the work that the equity committee did around law enforcement. I think all of those things are a response to the very visible injustices of the last 4 years. And so I do think the kids, I would say particularly the white kids, the things they talk to me about might be different because those things are so, in some way, are becoming more visible and more mainstream, for lack of a better word.
So we've hit our time. I apologize to those of you who weren't able to get your question answered. I think we could keep Andrea here all day if we could. And just as a side note, as soon as Andrea's dissertation is available in publication, we will certainly obtain a copy for the library. And so that will be available for anybody to read free, of course. I want to thank you again, Andrea, for joining us today and remind everyone that this recording will be available on Facebook shortly after we conclude and should be up on the library's YouTube page tomorrow. So if you'd like to watch again or share it anywhere, you'll be able to do so. Thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Andrea, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, for having me.